Hello, I'm Steve Dittmore, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
Yeah, we got Steve on the show. He's written a fantastic book about a guy named Jim Gilliam who played baseball for the Dodgers in the 50s and 60s. And, that's just like the tip of the iceberg with how great and interesting it is. We got a big boost from Not Gaetti today on Twitter.
We did.
Who did a NEPTA. Not enough people talk about Jim Gilliam for this episode in support of that. And then, of course, we have my buddy, see if I can point to him down here, Rob Neyer, who's also written books on baseball and done it at the highest level. And so it's really neat to be able to put the two of you together, but also just to talk about Jim Gilliam. And so do you say Gilliam or Gilliam? How do you say it?
Gilliam.
Gilliam. Okay.
Yeah.
So thanks for being on the show. And Rob, thanks for being on the show.
Happy to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. Why Jim Gilliam?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I grew up in Los Angeles in the 1970s, born, late 60s, grew up there in the 70s. My first impression as a young kid was of the Dodgers. Played T-ball. I played first base. My name was Steve. I fell in love with Steve Garvey and that whole era of the 1970s Dodgers. And as I've grown, matured, and gone through a couple of different career iterations, one of the things I've always really loved is writing. 2 degrees in journalism, and I was like, I want to tackle a book, and I don't really know how to do this or how I'm going to find the resources. But I got down this pathway of who's an interesting Dodgers person that nobody has written about. To your point about the Twitter shout out from Not Gaetti, is people don't talk about Jim Gilliam. And I'm fascinated by the Negro Leagues. He played in the Negro Leagues for a number of years, got his start there. And I just kept asking around and found people who knew about it, knew about Gilliam, knew about, people that knew him, and it just stuck. And the more I got into it, the more fascinated I became about his story as someone who dropped out of high school in the 11th grade. Grew up in segregated Nashville in the 1930s and 40s, dropped out of high school in 11th grade, played in the Negro Leagues. And, we can go through this, Pete, but I mean, he could have been in the majors a lot earlier than he was, and probably should have been, except that baseball just wasn't ready for certain number of black players in a lineup. And
yeah, let's talk about that, because one of the other things that happens is they erase a couple of his major league years and turn them into not even minor league years. Like they just take 49 and 50, if I'm remembering correctly, and completely remove that from his record on Baseball Reference. So not only is he, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and I definitely count those things, because in 1949, the Baltimore Eli Giants won the Negro Leagues championship. And Gilliam is one of a handful of players to win both a Negro Leagues championship and a Major League Baseball World Series. And I think regardless of whether the Negro Leagues were in decline or had declined in 1949 and 1950, the reality was Gilliam was playing at a very high level in that league at that time. He didn't get to choose who his opponents were, but he was still performing. And I think it is worth noting that, he homered in the 1950 East-West All-Star game. He homered in the 1959 Major League Baseball All-Star game. He is the only player in history to hit a home run in both of those games. And, we can talk about the Negro League's demise in 49 and 50, but those statistics are really hard to find. They just don't exist. And like you said, Major League Baseball doesn't recognize them. Seam Heads doesn't really have them. It's hard to piece together that era, but Bob Luke wrote a fascinating book about the Baltimore Eli Giants. I leaned on that heavily and talked to Bob about that era. And, they were the best Negro Leagues team in 1949, without a doubt.
There's also the fact that he's playing against future major leaguers, and then dudes who might have in other situations been major leaguers, but weren't, partly because the color barrier wasn't just obliterated in one big hit. It was there. It was there. And you talk about the different levels of having to break through, and Jim is bound up in a number of them, and then he actually gets through. So the guys that he played with that should have gotten through, they didn't even get a chance to really get after it.
Yeah, much of his players that mentored him and influenced him during his time on the Eli Giants, George Scales, Pee Wee Butts, Henry Kimbrough, those guys never got a chance to play in the majors. Jim did. And then he wound up spending 2 years in Montreal Dodgers top minor league system team, simply because the Dodgers already had 4 black players on their roster. And that's about the best reason to keep him down there, because he was performing at an extremely high level for Montreal.
Yeah. I don't want to not include Rob, so I'm going to let Rob ask a question.
Yeah.
Rob?
Oh, gosh. I mean, there were so many things in all of that piqued my curiosity or my interest. Pete, you go ahead, because I have too much going through my brain right now to come up with anything.
All right, I'm gonna let. So when we look at his career as a whole, one of the things that struck me was, he doesn't even appear to be a borderline Hall of Famer when you just look at the black and white of a table, but then you realize, okay, well, he's bound up from getting in the game, because of this kind of second tier of the racial divide. They're just not going to have enough slots for these guys, because they're like, oh, 4 or 5 people on a team. Hey, hang on a second, So he's still fighting that fight. And we always give credit to the World War II guys, right? Be like, hey, they could have played. So how much extra stuff? I mean, the guy's getting on base. He's got total bases in excess of 200. We're going to get super deep into the dumb numbers here, but he's got, like I said, he went to Montreal and was a major league level player when he was at Montreal. Someone screaming to be promoted, but wasn't allowed. So what do you do with those 4 years, the 2 in Montreal, the 2 championship grade years, those last 2 years in the Negro Leagues? How does that? I mean, that's 4 years of young 20-year-old play.
Right.
That stacks up well when you start to all of a sudden his peers on the big tables are like Manny Ramirez and people that are top 70 to top 40 ball players all time.
Yeah, I think that's what's most disheartening about it, is that Gilliam effectively lost those age 21 to 24 year seasons, right? I mean, that was the period of time that he was playing those last 2 years in the Negro Leagues, and then 2 years in Montreal. And it would be interesting to see how he would have performed, because he comes up in 1953, makes his debut with the Brooklyn Dodgers, wins Rookie of the Year, leads the league in triples, leads the league in plate appearances, walks over 100 times. He's got 700 plate appearances, leads the Dodgers to the World Series, serves as a catalyst in the leadoff spot for Brooklyn. And it's hard to think that, the Dodgers could have benefited from that in 1952 when they played the Yankees in the World Series. But they weren't ready to do that. They already had Campanella and Jackie Robinson and Joe Black. Don Newcomb was in the military. Sandy Amoros was joining the scene at this point in time. So they already had, their number that they wanted, and no other team had more. And I'm not, picking on the Dodgers in this instance. No other team was willing to take on more black players than that.
Yeah. And I don't want to go ahead, Rob.
Well, I'll weigh in on the Hall of Fame.
Okay.
Piece, if it's okay.
Go ahead.
When I look at his career and the history of the game generally, it's difficult or unrealistic to expect anyone to play regularly in the major leagues at the age of 20. I think that's fair. The only, it happened more often back in those days than it does now. But outside of players like Ted Williams and Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle, to name just 3, very few have been able to play regularly and play effectively at that age. Not to suggest that someone couldn't have gotten a better, with more fairness, he couldn't have been in the majors. But let's assume for a minute that he's playing at 21. Clearly, his talent, his performance that we have in AAA and then in the majors suggests that he was talented enough to be in the major leagues at 21. If you give him 150 hits per season from 21 to 23, his age 24 season was his rookie year when he won Rookie of the Year. That gets him right around 2,500 hits. And that's if you're playing middle infield, that's a Hall of Fame resume, or it's at least a borderline Hall of Fame resume. Now, as it happened, he didn't play just middle infield, right? He played everywhere. And we really have very little context for what was essentially a super utility player for that many years. Most of the players, maybe all of the players who have filled that role, filled it for a few seasons. Ben Zobrist comes to mind, for example. He didn't have the career length that Jim Gilliam had. And so he would have been a singular Hall of Fame candidate had he been in the major leagues for those 3 additional seasons or 3 plus. I doubt if the voters would have recognized him in the 1960s and 70s, because the voters typically didn't recognize people's obvious qualifications. It would be a very interesting case now for people, especially if they considered his Negro League seasons, which I think they probably would nowadays. So yeah, it's funny. The AAA seasons are tough because the voters are now encouraged to consider Negro League seasons, especially if they're assigned major league status. But nobody ever says, "Hey, you need to count those AAA seasons too." That does not happen. I've never heard anyone reference AAA seasons. So it would be a very interesting case to make. I think you could make a compelling case, but I've never seen anyone make it, except perhaps in your book.
And I don't even know that I would say that Gilliam's overall body of work constitutes being a Hall of Famer. But the reality is he has 0 votes. He was never, that I could find, on a ballot. Jay Jaffe, Adam Dorowski, others that have kind of looked at this stuff much more closely than I have, talked to them. Yeah, they feel it's a big snub. And I compare in the book to Roy McMillan, who was a contemporary of Gilliam's in the 50s and 60s, a great glove shortstop with the Cincinnati Reds and others. And he got more votes, even though his statistics, yes, he was a good fielder, and yes, he won Gold Gloves, and yes, he had a permanent position, but he never played in a World Series. Jim Gilliam played in 7. He won 4 World Series titles. He at least deserved the courtesy of being on a ballot and being recognized by however many baseball writers would deem it appropriate. He should have been in that conversation.
Right. Well, now everyone's on the ballot, basically, who has a career
Correct.
length. But back in those days, for whatever reason, I don't know what the process was for being on a ballot, but it's pretty clear in retrospect, I think, that Gilliam was a better, more valuable player over the course of his career than McMillan was. But McMillan probably was more famous. He had a brief period where he was well known, probably because he won a bunch of Gold Gloves, is my guess.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to go back to the racial part of this thing too, because this is a theme throughout the book, obviously, because it's part of what Jim had to experience. When we look at the Dodgers and all the major leagues in general, it's easy from our vantage point of history, looking backwards and also like where we are now socially, it's easy to cast a lot of judgment, but these folks are also running a business, and it's not like baseball has 3 million fans a year busting through the door. So they're trying to sort this thing out. And it's not as easy as we want it to be. This doesn't absolve anybody of bad behavior, but we also have to understand these things take time to sort out, right? And so as much as we want this to be an instant change, hey, Jackie Robinson fixed it, it really wasn't like that. And it was very, from their point of view, when they're in it, they don't know where all this stuff is going. And so for them, it's perilous to defy the cultural norms. They're pushing. All the teams are trying to figure this out. Some teams faster than others, but we can't lose sight of the fact that when you're doing these things in real time and trying to run a business and trying to win ball games, it's not as easy as we want it to be now.
Sure, I can agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. But I think where I took the book, and you reference this, is what I was trying to illustrate is that Jim Gilliam was caught up in these 4 different gates, as I call them. So Jackie Robinson goes through the first one, and until Jackie Robinson in 1946 signs with the Dodgers, or debuts in 47, I guess he debuted in 46 with Montreal, but 47, they didn't think that Negro Leaguers didn't think that they had a right to play, or that they were never going to get that chance. And Jim was, I found some quotes from him that talked about that. And then you get to the second gate, which is the number of black players in a lineup. And you can make an argument that, even in his age 20 season or his age 21 season, if he'd been in with the Dodgers, maybe not in the starting lineup as a bench player, he was probably more valuable than some of the players that they kept, a Bobby Morgan or a Rocky Bridges, or these kind of white infielders that could only bat from one
Even
side.
Billy Cox.
Even Billy, well, yeah, I mean, Billy Cox created a whole another controversy in 1953 because Cox was the one that went to the bench. So until you were able to get a lineup, and the Dodgers became the first team in 1954 to start 5 black players in a lineup. So they had a greater than 50% of the lineup was black, and they were the first team to do that. But then you get post-career, and who becomes kind of the first base coach? And that's Jim Gilliam. Jim Gilliam is the first. He's not the first black coach. That was Gene Baker and then Buck O'Neill, but he's the first black coach on the diamond. He's the first one to be inside the field of play, if you will, as a coach coaching first base for the Dodgers. And then it's, well, when is baseball going to hire a black manager? And that's kind of that fourth gate. And that was something Jim never got the opportunity to do. He was talked about in every magazine article that you can find from the late 60s, from Sport Magazine to SI and Baseball Digest and everywhere else. Gilliam is mentioned alongside Ernie Banks and Hank Aaron and many others that were contemporaries of his as a candidate to be the first black manager.
And then, by the way, Steve, if you don't mind, I would argue, and you write about this really well in the book, I would argue that Gilliam might well have been the most qualified of all those candidates.
100%.
Not purely because of the things people said about him at the time, but one of the striking things to me, and I've read a lot of those articles because I have a big collection of those late 1960s magazines, and those articles, every year, multiple magazines had an article on this, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things that has struck me again and again and again is that with the exception of Gilliam, nobody even mentioned anyone who wasn't a superstar, which I'm sure you noticed. Well, What does that say about Gilliam? If he's the only guy who's not a superstar, then it's pretty clear to me that people saw something in him that frankly they didn't see in any other black player or coach of that time. I suspect he would have been the best of all those candidates that were mentioned, and maybe the best of any black. I mean, look, there have to have been dozens of great candidates among the black players that didn't even get talked about. Had to have been. Gilliam was the only one who stood out enough among the non-stars to be in those articles. And maybe that might be the biggest injustice of all, is that he seems like he might have been the single best candidate and never got a shot.
Yeah, I think a lot of that, Pete and I were talking before we came on about Jim's baseball IQ. And that was something that, as I talked to either players who played alongside of him in the 1960s or players that he coached in the 1970s, everyone just talked about how smart he was. And Walt Alston always complimented him. Fred Clare, when I talked to him, Peter O'Malley, when I talked to him, they just said, the guy never made a mistake. He was never in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was always positioned perfectly. He knew what the play was. And he knew how to win games. And that, Rob, to your point is, those are the intangibles that, he wasn't a superstar. Sure. He wasn't Hank Aaron or Ernie Banks or Frank Robinson, but he certainly knew how to win, and he would credit George Scales from the Negro Leagues and Pee Wee Butts and Henry Kimbrough as being his mentors and the ones that taught him to play baseball that way.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, when you go back to look at Hall of Fame candidacy and everything, now we're having to look at, gosh, he could have been a manager or some significant kind of, we didn't have bench coaches back then, but he didn't really get that shot, partly because this is the third gate you were talking about. So
the fourth gate's the manager. The third gate was being the first coach. So it's Jackie Robinson. When are there going to be enough black, or when do we move beyond this quota? When do we get a black into a coaching position? And then when do we get a black into a managerial position? And obviously that took from 47 to 75 when Frank Robinson became manager of the Yankees. Of the Indians. So that, that was almost a period of 30 years before all that transpired.
Yeah. When you look at his play too, so many, back to the IQ thing, so many references that are just high grade. And we discussed the one, I think it was off camera, but, was it Wes Parker that said, he would, it was Roseboro, I think, he would put the bat in front of the catcher's eyes to shield their ability to see the field as well.
That was
Yeah.
an anecdote that Al Ferrara told me, after he
Mm.
went to the Padres in the late '60s during their expansion year, and he asked the catcher, Chris Cannizzaro, who would go on to play for the Dodgers in the early '70s, which Dodger he hated the most, and it was because Cannizzaro said it was Gilliam, because every time he would square around a bunt, he would put the bat right at eye level, and he couldn't see if the runner was going or not, and it was just something very subtle, very small, but it could have got a runner in scoring position, which, as we know, the Dodgers of the 1960s, that was the MO: get Morey on first, get him over to second base somehow, move him to third, and then have Tommy or Willie Davis hit a sac fly and drive him in.
Yeah, it's remarkable, and they did that a lot. And as much as we devalue stolen bases, man, that is how they lived, was that kind of thing, and to great success, right? They continue to go to the World Series, and when you look at the talent that the Dodgers had in the early '60s, there's a lot of players, but you don't have. Well, I mean, at one point they had Frank Robinson, but you don't have a player who's just like a Titanic kind of, let's lean on this MVP player. It's just a bunch of people contributing. I mean, Tommy Davis, Willie Davis, all these guys, a lot of times they're moving around. And I think Al Campanis talks about this. I think you talked about this in the book too, where the Dodgers' way of playing is to get a couple of gloves and get ready.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, the Dodgers did that early on. I make the point with Jackie Robinson. They made him a first baseman, even though he was a shortstop with the Kansas City Monarchs. Gilliam came up as a second baseman, but ultimately he wound up playing nearly as many games at third base as he did at second, and had another, 500 starts in the outfield as well. Which I think, getting back to the conversation about Hall of Fame and not having a true position, I think that's one of the things that works against Gilliam, of course, right? Is,
Sure.
he did start more games at second base than anywhere else. However, he played every position with the exception of pitcher, catcher, and shortstop in a major league game. And, so he played all over the diamond.
Well, and that's one thing that maybe I'm missing some recent work that's been done, but I know for years I sort of lamented the fact that no one, including me, had ever come up with a good way to measure the value of versatility. Right? It's one thing to look at fielding statistics, but it's another thing to figure out how much it's worth to a team to have someone who can effectively play 3 or 4 or 5 positions.
Yeah, and the Dodgers still value that to this day, obviously.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
that's how they assemble their lineups.
Yep.
We can take the modern Dodgers, and they continue to do this thing where they'll like grab a bunch of gloves and get ready, and Kike Hernandez. So we're talking about a guy at the end of their bench who, and we'll use the Bavasi thing. He's many players, right? So all the way at the end of your bench, 13th, 12th player on the team, he is plug and play any position you want, including first base. At his best, he destroys left-handers. There was a year when he and Giancarlo Stanton were like 1 and 2 and just destroying left-handed pitching. And so you have all these things. Like, how many spots is one dude filling on this team? To include getting guys off their feet and playing their spot for him. So how do you value that versatility? It's really tough with WAR or other metrics to know that, hey, Alston's like, I don't know where you're going to play, and we got all these guys competing for whatever you think your spot is. But every year, there's the manager going, this guy's indispensable. Like, they wouldn't trade him, and they always played him. A lot of play, like tons and tons of plate appearances.
That was something else. Go ahead.
No, please go ahead, Rob. What were you saying?
That's something else that I find striking about Gilliam's career, and you write about this in the book, but almost every year for a long stretch, there would be talk about the Dodgers not having a space for him or a regular spot for him, and maybe he should be traded to someone who would play him every day, and yet they kept him. And one of the things that I think that isn't often remarked upon is that if you go back and look at baseball history, you will find players whose teams, once they had him, did not want him to go anywhere. Even if he wasn't performing at a high level. And some of Gilliam's seasons with the bat were not outstanding later in his career, especially. And then you have other players who seem to be quite talented, and yet for some reason they keep changing teams year in, year out. And there are reasons why these things happen, right? And I think you have a lot of great quotes in the book from teammates, which suggests why the Dodgers were so interested in keeping him around. But his value, and this is, if it's hard to measure versatility, it's impossible to measure the effect one has on one's teammates. But it seems pretty clear from the record and from the quotes that he was valuable just by his nature, just being around him. There was a value there as well. He was sort of one of those secret ingredients of the Dodgers' success in that era.
Yeah, I mean, he was definitely a good teammate. People revered him as a teammate, as a coach. You know, I think the quote, I'm going to butcher it somehow, but I think Dusty Baker called him like his uncle. You know, he's like, that was the analogy that Dusty used about how it was to play with him or play for him, I guess, in the late 70s there. You know, in Gilliam, the thing I was going to point out was he started more opening days on the bench than he did in the starting lineup during his Dodgers career. And yet he still averaged close to 145 games played a season.
Right. Those two things don't really square, do they?
I'm sorry?
Those two things don't really square. You wouldn't expect that. He might be the only one ever with numbers like that.
Yeah. And, you know, it was one year it would be second base. Next year it would be third base. You know, he would just bounce around. And Alston, the Dodgers ran through a lot of these, what Alston called phenoms in the early 60s. And many of them were very gracious to talk to me. I've talked to, you know, kind of role players like John Werhaus and Nate Oliver and Darrell Griffith and some of the members of the 1960s Dodgers that lasted 2 or 3 years, bounced between the minors and the majors, but they were all infielders. And all of them said to me, Gilliam was a great teammate, taught them a lot, but those players just never really were able to sustain the level of performance, and they would get shipped back down to the minors, and Gilliam would fill their spot. And that was pretty much the case from 62 to 65 was more or less what happened there. I mean, there were other guys that he replaced. Ken McMullen was part of the Dodgers in the early 60s as a third baseman. They wound up trading him. Darrell Spencer was a part of it. The
people who ran the Dodgers had all come up under Branch Rickey, basically.
Yep.
And Rickey famously talked about players in their 30s being on the downside of their careers, right? So it was probably, correct me if I'm wrong, my guess is it was an organizational philosophy that when a player hits 30-ish, we need to be thinking about who's next.
Right.
And in that case, it turned out for another 4 or 5, 6 years, there just wasn't anybody better than him for that role.
Yeah, that's a good way. It's a good way to summarize it. I hadn't, looked at it exactly that way, but they certainly had enough players that had success in the minors that just didn't translate into the majors that they ran out there, and it just didn't work.
Which isn't to say they didn't develop players, because they developed a lot of players in that era. One of the things you talk about is just Alston's trust and requirement that he puts on Gilliam, and to even the point where, like, I'm just going to sit on this bench. And I think the quote was, he pushed buttons, and then Gilliam's going to go help me manage the pitcher. He's going to go talk to Bobby Valentine and be like, you are turning the double play the wrong way, fixing less part. And when you start to add these things where, he's reducing everybody's errors, he's making them more efficient on the field and everything, that doesn't show up in OPS plus. And he, by OPS plus, gosh, he's worthless, right? But man, oh man,
I wouldn't go that far, Pete. He's pretty good.
Okay. Well, to a lot of people who get extreme with their analysis, right? Like he's,
he's a below average. By OPS plus, he was below average.
Yeah. So what do we do with that, Rob? How do we reckon that?
Well, I think, first of all, his wins above replacement is excellent for a player with his career length. I mean, we're talking basically 12 seasons, I think, roughly. And I believe his wins above replacement, Baseball Reference, is around 44. That's really good. Yeah. That's 3.5 or almost 4 per season. That's essentially a Hall of Fame level player. If you do that for 20 years, you're at 80 and you're in the Hall of Fame. So wins above replacement does, I think, a pretty good job of measuring his overall value as a hitter and purely as a fielder making plays, where it obviously doesn't help him, as again, it can't measure versatility as sort of an amorphous how much easier does this make the manager's job? Well, good luck measuring that, right? I think it can be done, and I'm sure there are people who have done it. Maybe major league teams have analysts who have done this work to try to figure it out. There's some value there. We just don't know how much it is. Was his versatility worth 3 wins over the course of his career or 10? I honestly have no idea. And then the chemistry piece, another thing that we can't measure. Was he worth, I don't think it was 0. Was it 2 over the course of his career? Was it 8? Again, I don't know. I think the consensus, now I'm getting a little bit outside, I'm digressing, but teams don't seem willing to pay very much for chemistry. And by that, I mean, it's often said that players are great in the clubhouse and that they have this incredible additional worth that doesn't show up in the statistics. But we can quantify a win because we know what teams pay for them or what they hope to pay for them. It's between $8 and $10 million. I haven't seen anyone yet pay $8 million for extra for a player because of how great he is in the clubhouse. So baseball people are somewhat skeptical, even though they acknowledge that its chemistry is important. We don't think it's 0. Above that, who knows? But I do think that just on the stuff that we can measure, Gilliam was an excellent player because, as Steve well knows, he was effective at every position that he played. He was a good second baseman, a good third baseman, and I think a pretty good outfielder as well. So even though his OPS plus is not fantastic, it's a little below average, because he was playing these positions, because he played in an era which turned out to be not very good for hitters, and because he was good pretty much wherever he played, there's a lot of value there that we actually can measure. That was sort of a big takeaway for me when I was doing a little research before our conversation. Was I actually was surprised by how much value we can measure, how much value he had. He was one of the Dodgers. I mean, I'm guessing, Steve, you could confirm this. He's got to be one of the Dodgers' top 3 or 4 players over the course of a decade.
Certainly, I didn't look at an objective measure like WAR or something like that over the course from that period of time. How many where he stood up in that, but I guess one way that I evaluate it, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, is he played on 7 World Series teams. The only other Dodgers to do that were Pee Wee Reese, Carl Ferrello, and Duke Snider. He played on 4 World Series championship teams. Now, Koufax was on 4, Padres was on 4, but neither of them actually played in 4. Koufax didn't play in 55, and Padres didn't play in 65. So Gilliam's the only one to play in the 55, 59, 63, and 65 World Series. So getting back to kind of measuring this, you're playing on 7 World Series teams, 4 that won the World Series title. That's pretty remarkable for a period during that 53 to 66 time period. You're bridging 2 states, opposite ends of the country, everything else that was transpiring.
Right, and of course he probably should have been on 52 and 53 teams as well.
Yeah, he was on 53, 52.
I'm sorry, 52. Yeah. So, I mean, a championship player, and obviously, one of the issues was that he bridges those 2 teams, and this is sort of one of the underlying premises of the book. Maybe the underlying premise is he never received the attention that Robinson and Snyder and the others did in Brooklyn, or that Wills and Koufax and Drysdale and Tommy Davis did in Los Angeles. But really, here's one thing I think I did notice at some point a long time ago. He's really the only player who was outstanding for multiple seasons in both places, I think.
Yeah. He's the only. Hodges was toward the diminishing part of his career. He played a few years with Los Angeles. Snyder played a few years in Los Angeles, but they were all on the decline at that point in time. Koufax really wasn't a factor in Brooklyn. Obviously, he was dominant in Los Angeles, of course. But yeah, Rhodesboro played a few games in Brooklyn, I think, before he kind of came on the scene in Los Angeles. But yeah, there's nobody else that kind of bridges both of those teams like that. So yeah, I mean, obviously, I spent a lot of time reading and talking to people about this, so I'm a little bit passionate about it. But I do think that he is definitely underrated in that regard. I mean, you bring up 52. If he played on that team, then it's 8 World Series that conceivably he could have played in. He's still played in 38 or 39 World Series games. That's a pretty high number. He's still near the top 10 in World Series bases on balls. I think he's 11th among all active major leaguers. So he's near the top 10 in some World Series statistics, which is, again, I think people, selfishly, I think people don't realize that and recognize that. It's, people we should be talking more about, right? But those things to me about his career at a time when he was dealing with racial prejudice. He was in the Negro Leagues. He was with superstars that were, much louder and much more vocal. I mean, Maury Wills was definitely somebody who enjoyed the spotlight. Jackie Robinson was a household name. They're immortalized. Duke Snider, they're immortalized in pop culture and music and everything else. And there's kind of just steady Jim Gilliam, the guy that just shows up every day. And, I talk a lot in the book about him being a company man and, just showing up, doing your job and doing it at a high level every day.
So during the civil rights era, there were stories and articles in those years that would essentially divide the superstar players into two camps. I'm sure you're aware of this. Those who were actively engaged with or vocal about civil rights, and
Correct.
those who weren't.
Yep.
And a lot of those things, a lot of times, the line was not so stark. For example, there were players who were criticized for not engaging, but actually, if you dig in a little bit, yes, they were at a march or they were at a rally, whatever it was. But how did Gilliam negotiate? Was he not forced to engage with the division because he wasn't a superstar, or was he involved in that somehow?
He wasn't really involved in it. The only time that I could find that he was really active and really took kind of a stand, there were 2 instances, one of which was integrating Dodgertown in Vero Beach and assisting with that process. And the other was in 1968 when Martin Luther King passed away. At that point in time, the Dodgers didn't have many black players on their roster in 1968. It was, gosh, I'm doing this off the top of my head. I think Jim Mudcat Grant was on the roster. Willie Crawford may have been a rookie or, around that time period. They didn't have many black players on the roster. And so they looked to Willie Davis would have still been on the roster. They looked to Gilliam for that. And, he did kind of say, yeah, I think we should all, look at this and make our own decisions about whether we play or not, because, the Dodgers got embroiled in a controversy about whether or not they would play on the day of Martin Luther King's funeral. He did hang out with some athletes from other sports. He hung out a little bit with Bill Russell from the NBA. Muhammad Ali and he were kind of casual acquaintances. Muhammad had called the hospital to check on him after he slipped into a coma in 1978. But he wasn't the outspoken one, and nobody really asked him about that. I mean, I tried to find, I asked people about that, about 1965 and the Watts riots, Michael Leahy wrote a great book, the Lost Innocence, or about the 60s era Dodgers, and he talks about Grant and Roseboro and some of the other Dodgers of that era and how they dealt with these things. Gilliam he just kind of kept to himself. Even his widow Edwina said, yeah, he didn't really want to engage in the talk about race and things like that. He just wanted to be behind the scenes.
I want to take over for a second here so I can do a little bit of work for you. Look at this book right there. Jim Gilliam, The Forgotten Dodger. The book is not out yet if you're watching it live right now.
Yeah,
there it is. Look at that.
Yep.
Yeah, put that thing up there. Let me get this thing out of the way. There it is.
There we go.
And there's the author right there. There's Steve. you want to get this book if you love baseball history. If you love the Dodgers, that's clearly obvious. But if you're into the Negro Leagues, all kinds of things are packed into this, especially if it's going to be holiday season here. You can be buy ahead on the pre-buy. Here's the thing I always say, and you guys know what I'm going to say. Buy two, buddy read it. Get one for you and your kid, get one for you and your dad, get one for you and your mom, whatever it's going to be. Buy two, buddy read it, and know that you're going to love this thing because it's just packed full of details. Super, like a lot of details. I wanted to back the conversation up a few minutes because in 51, look, I'm going to pick on Cox. I like Billy Cox. I think he was great, but he wasn't a super great player, right? He has one of his better years in 51, one of his two really good years in 51, and his WAR was 2.1. The next two seasons, Gilliam's probably averaging 3+ because that's the kind of player he was. He was doing well in Montreal, so there is some call to have him on that team potentially. Or look, if he's not better than Billy Cox, is he better than Andy Pofko? Andy Pofko plays 80 games and he's good. But is Junior better? I don't know, probably, right? And so this goes back to that racial gate that he had to get through. And it's a shame, and he does lose a lot of credit for that. Wanted to ask you, there's a ton of in-game detail. Is that a decision that you made on purpose? Did I lose everything?
I can still hear you.
Oh, okay. My screen went black. Is that an in-game decision for you, to say, I'm going to put a lot of detail into this? Or what made you chose that path artistically in writing the book?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I don't know that I really had a conscious decision about it. I think that there were certain games that he played in that really warranted some really specific details. So Game 7 of the 1965 World Series, which is how I start the book, Gilliam makes arguably the most important play in the entire World Series, which is to backhand a ball behind third base, hit by Zoilo Versalles at a time when Koufax is on the ropes, gets a force out, helps Koufax get out of the inning, and Koufax goes on to win Game 7 and the Dodgers win the World Series. So I did spend a lot of time with that because that's a play that I think baseball people know and recognize, but not people that are not immersed in baseball. He was also in the 55 World Series, the game that the Dodgers actually won, Game 7, the year that they beat the Yankees. He was this close to factoring into the game in a negative way, which was he started the game in left field. Don Zimmer started the game at second base, and Alston pinch hit for Zimmer and moved Gilliam from left to second and put Sandy Amorose in left field. Well, Sandy Amorose, the next inning, of course, makes that catch against the left field line and doubles up the runner at first and gets the Dodgers out of that. There's no way Gilliam makes that play because Gilliam's a right-handed thrower and his gloves on his left hand, Amorose a lefty, gloves on the right hand, etc. So those two games, I think, were games that I really spent a lot of time and got into some detail on. As I was doing research, I kept finding things to me that made Gilliam an interesting person. And so the book does kind of chop up into little different segments of, this is what life was like for him as an endorser of products. He was a spokesperson of cigarettes, of RC Cola, of televisions, of beech nut chewing gum. I mean, he was featured in a lot of ads in the 1950s and 60s. His wife, Edwina, was featured prominently in the black press in Los Angeles as one of the best dressed women of Los Angeles. And, they were in the society pages quite a bit. And so there was that. Gilliam was a fabulous golfer. He loved to play golf. He was an excellent card player. He gets his nickname, the Devil, ostensibly from going into a pool hall in Gifford, which was the place that black players could go out when they were in Vero Beach. He allegedly slaps $20 on the pool table and says, "Who wants a piece of the Devil?" Nobody took him up on it. Later years, when he was asked about it, he said, "Oh, if anybody had challenged me, I would have taken my money and run," because he wasn't a good billiards player. But there was those kind of different elements of this that I just felt created a picture. I mean, he died at age 49. He didn't have a full life in a lot of ways, and so to find these things like that I think really tried to create a picture of who he was both on and off the field. I mean, we've talked a lot about who he was on the field, and that's certainly important. That's what a lot of people remember. But he had some other interests as well, and was involved pretty prominently in that. So I don't know, Pete, if I'm answering your question about spending time in games, but those two games that I mentioned were the two that I really did kind of go deep dives into.
Heck, you did great for me. I was putting up everybody's handles and links to Substacks, and so you gave me the perfect answer, man. That was great. I'm going to kick Rob over and let him ask something.
Steve, it's surprising to me how many endorsements.
Yeah, wasn't it?
How did he get to a point where he was well known enough that his name and likeness were valuable to advertisers?
Part of me thinks, and I don't really write about this, so this is just a knee-jerk reaction, but part of me thinks, to your point about Jackie Robinson and being more outspoken, Jim, or Junior, when he was with the Brooklyn Dodgers, he was often called Junior when he was with the Dodgers, he was quiet, and he appealed to a black audience. And Jackie was in the decline of his career in the 55, 56 seasons. And so I think Gilliam became that person. You don't see Don Newcomb or Roy Campanella in quite as many. Campanella did do some endorsements, but I think, and I write about this, that Madison Avenue, I think they just figured out, hey, people who are black that spend their money, it's worth the same as people who are white, and why not get some people to endorse the products that are that? Because he was well known then, traveling to Los Angeles, they put some initial advertising campaign around Packard Bell televisions and things like that when the team relocated to Los Angeles, where it was Gilliam and it was Pee Wee Reese and Walt Alston, and those were the ones that were the most prominent names that were still transitioning there. Duke Snyder, Gil Hodges, that sort of thing. So he because he bridged those two things, I think that was what led it to it. He didn't do quite as much in Los Angeles as he did when he was in Brooklyn. He did get a job off season, as many players had at that time in baseball, had off season jobs. He got a job as a sales rep for Hiram Walker alcohol, and so he was often doing those things. He was really one of the Dodgers, because he lived in Los Angeles in the offseason, one of the ones that would go to car dealerships and do promotions and things like that. He was just accessible.
And I'm guessing that his huge rookie season probably created some momentum in that regard, right?
No, sure. I mean, I think that's absolutely true. Yeah, good point. Winning the Rookie of the Year, helping the Dodgers get back to the World Series in 53, then helping them win the World Series in 55, even though he didn't have a great World Series. He 53, he did pretty well. 55, he struggled a little bit in the World Series, but and then in 56, he arguably had his best season offensively. I don't know if one of you got the stats in front of you, but his WAR in 1956 was pretty remarkable. I think he was fifth in the National League in MVP voting in 1956. So that was his best season offensively.
Yeah, I post this post because you reference this in your book. There's this great. So this is what a highlight clip used to look like, everybody. And this is Jim saving the series, saving Sandy Koufax's win. And Lou Johnson getting credit too for his big hit, but it's a 5-panel of a single play that changes the outcome of really what is the last hurrah of those 60s era Dodgers.
Yeah, without a doubt. And that was, that play, Gilliam talked afterward about Zoilo Versales had been drilling the ball down the left field line all series. And earlier in the series, he'd hit one off of Gilliam's chest for an error and things like that. And so Gilliam was cheating him a little bit more to the left field line. So, I mean, if you want to put that back up just for a quick second, if you can, you see that he's reaching across his body, gloves it, goes into foul territory, hops up. There's runners on first and second, one out at this moment. Frank Quilla sees the runner from second going down to third, steps on the bag to get the force play. And I remember talking to Wes Parker, who was across the diamond at first base, saying, Gilliam just knew, this gets back to the IQ. He just knew that the only play that he had was to go to third base. Somebody else might have tried to get a double play, get out of the inning, and you would wind up getting nobody out. or you still wind up with a runner at third. He goes, gets the easy play, doesn't even try to throw across the diamond, and then Koufax gets the next guy to pop up. And ironically, as the Dodgers and Alston had done all season long, took Gilliam out in the ninth inning for John Kennedy, put him in for defensive purposes.
Yeah. You talk about two different things that Jim has to get over in his career, earlier on in his career. One is does not like flying, and then the other one wasn't comfortable around white people in integration. So we always talk about like knock the walls down and let everybody play, a kind of thing. But the reality is there's also a transition on the other side too. So talk a little bit about that and what that meant for Jim.
Sure. Yeah. The thing about not flying was interesting. He didn't like doing that, but he quickly realized that he could make money if he flew. He spent a lot of winters, both when he was with the Eli Giants and then when he was with Montreal down in Puerto Rico playing for Santurce, where he was actually a teammate of an 18-year-old outfielder named Roberto Clemente on one of the Santurce teams. So he figured out pretty quickly that he could overcome that. He still did. He never liked it by all accounts that I could find, but he did go to Hawaii with the Dodgers. The Dodgers took a group to Japan after the 56 World Series and things like that. And so he did travel with them on some long flights. The part about integrating and being with white people, yeah, it took him a bit. I mean, the first time that he really played with white players was actually in Puerto Rico, because he'd always been in the Negro Leagues. He'd always done that. Roy Campanella picked him up after the 53 season, and they did some barnstorming together as part of the Campanella All-Stars. And so there was some more of that. He did get, one of the things I wrote about is the fact that he got booed in Baltimore the first time he went there as a member of the Montreal Royals. Baltimore Orioles were the minor league team at the time, and he went there and he got booed, even though he'd played most of his professional career in Baltimore as a member of the Eli Giants. And he was a little surprised by that. But even when he went to Nashville, where he grew up and where he was from, the Dodgers in 53, as spring training ended, they played a series of games against the Milwaukee Braves, progressing northward. They go to Nashville, and they put 12,000 people in Sulphur Dell, and blacks and whites, they all came out. He did play with white kids in the sandlots of Nashville, played a lot, kind of integrated ball that way. But, as a professional, it was really until he got into the minors and the Caribbean League before he was playing alongside whites.
Uh-oh, you're on mute. I think so.
I love the old tradition, no longer observed, because I know that Gilliam wasn't the only one, not even the only Dodger, who essentially retired as a coach and then was brought back as a player during the season. I think Manny Mota did that maybe more than once.
Yeah,
which is a wonderful tradition. I wish that players would still consider doing that. I guess everyone's so specialized now; it's difficult to convince anyone to do it. But one of my favorite stories about Gilliam is that he was basically done and got called back, got added to the roster, and then had one of his best seasons, at least with the bat.
Yeah, 65, he had a really great season, playing in somewhat of a part-time role after he came back. And he, when you read about the decision in 1964 at the end of the season, when he had arguably his worst season statistically, and the Dodgers did not play well in 64, the Dodgers forced Leo DeRocher out as a coach and appointed Gilliam to be basically the replacement of DeRocher in the coaching ranks. And then in 1965, Tommy Davis slides into second base and breaks his ankle. And the Dodgers had tried all those other players at third base, including Tommy Davis, Ken McMullen, Darrell Griffith, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody was able to perform. And so they just basically activated Gilliam. And on days when he wasn't in the lineup, he was still coaching. So you're laughing, but I mean, it's the.
So would he coach at first base and then be called into pinch hit from that spot? Did that ever happen?
Potentially, yes. Yeah.
Wow.
Potentially he would start off if he wasn't in the starting lineup. Yeah. But he
Yeah.
didn't pinch hit much. I mean, well, Alston didn't do that. I mean, they eased him back into the lineup with pinch hitting roles, but once he got into the routine and they settled on, I mean, that 65, that 65 infield was, essentially Parker, Jim Lefevre, Maury Wills, and Gilliam, an all switch hitting infield. Lefevre was winning the Rookie of the Year in 1965. That was pretty much their regular standard lineup for the last half of the season. So he wasn't doing as much coaching, at least physically, on the diamond that way.
I know you talked to Peter O'Malley and Fred Clare, and I wonder, 'cause I'm working on a project where, gosh, if everything happens, we're going to do a documentary in the life of Felipe Alou. And one of the things that Dave Dombrowski says and Dan Duquette says about him is like, hey, we didn't realize he was so ready and so capable to be a manager. And that was because we had these, Dominicans can't manage lens in front of us. And we're glad we fixed that, right? So Jim certainly is going through a similar thing where, well, the Dodgers are packed with talent. There's people everywhere trying to, run the LA team and everything. But if he does survive, does he get there? Did Peter or, did anybody recognize that this guy needed to be a manager at some point? Was that a path that was available to him before he passed?
It really wasn't. I mean, yes, Alston retires after the 76 season. And so there's discussion who would be the next manager. And by that point in time, Tommy Lasorda had been added to the active coaching roster. He'd come up after managing in the minors, and, I trust Ron Say on this. Ron and I had a good conversation about this. And he basically just said, Alston was the one that had managed all of us. He knew how all of us ticked. Jim didn't really want to be that personality, that one that's always dealing with the media, that one that's always, answering questions and doing all that. Jim was the behind the scenes guy. And so Alston gets it, or excuse me, Lasorda gets it, replaces Alston, names Gilliam to be the batting coach for 1977. The Dodgers get back to the World Series after missing it in 75 and 76. He helps turn around. Steve Yeager has his best year ever under Jim's kind of tutelage as a hitting coach. And, that was the role that he was going to play. And I think he was pretty content with that. Edwina told me, yeah, he would have loved to have managed, but that was not, it wasn't the end all. He would do anything the Dodgers asked him to do.
Yeah. Rob, we're going to wrap this up real quick. Let me give you a chance to ask any kind of final questions.
Well, I don't. I just have an overarching comment, which is that you mentioned, Pete. You mentioned the details in the book, and they are there. But I've noticed that it's very tempting for biographers to include too many details because they do so much research and they want to get it all into the book. And I don't think he did that. I'm fairly critical when I read a book, whether it's baseball or anything else. I think, Steve, you found very close to the perfect mix of detail and broader picture and not dwelling for too long on any one thing. And I would say this is a great book for anyone who's interested in that era in baseball history or the Dodgers or just biographies in general. You did a great work and just admire the work, and I congratulate you for how it came out.
Thank you so much, Rob. I really appreciate that. It means a lot. And you're right. I mean, I've noticed today Pete posted a couple of articles that Jim Murray wrote that I was like, gosh, I didn't see those. And, so the completist in me is like, gosh, I needed those things for the book. But, you got to stop. Yeah, you got to stop at some point. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. The book really is fantastic. And because I like what you're doing and maybe one day we'll do something similar myself. But I found myself going to the text more, right? Like me as a reader, you could have given me more. It's fine. I went and researched it. I'm already thinking about having Leahy on the show. And, I just like blowing up all these contextual bubbles and just going in there and seeing what it's like. Well, when you talk about the Dodgers kind of transitioning away from black players, I'm like, yeah, but there's also this surge of talent that comes in. So now I'm all of a sudden looking at the Spokane Indians roster and I'm like, geez, it's loaded with people, and so it was great. So your context allowed me to go out and look at SI articles and all these other things. And that for me is a treat it takes forever to read a book, but it makes it a treat because there's all these secondary and even really tertiary things that fly into my head, and it all connects. And so, one, thank you for doing all that work. I really appreciate it. And two, I love the book. And the second it comes out, I'm going to buy a copy and thank you for that. I'm going to give you the floor to wrap things up.
No, I appreciate it both, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure of mine talking to you, and I'm happy that it's getting closer to actually being here. It's nice to, when this thing came the other day, I was like, okay, I can actually hold it now. It's tangible, right?
Yep, great moment.
Yeah, it is a good moment for sure, and I'm looking forward to tonight's game 5, obviously Dodgers Padres. So hoping that I will say too, the other thing that we didn't even talk about is that it was in this day in 1978 that Gilliam was laid to rest. So his funeral service, we didn't even really talk about his passing or anything like that, but it was on this day, which was the morning of Game 2 of the 1978 World Series, that occurred. So it was October 11th, a big day for Jim Gilliam.
Yeah, Rob had to go, so I kicked him out of the studio.
Yeah, no problem.
But thank you very much. I'm going to run these credits. I'll come right back and say goodbye to the official.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much.